The class had concluded, and the professor declared with confidence why humanity was the most peaceful, reasonable, cooperative, and overall superior species in the universe. His proclamation, met with a sea of silence from the varied alien students, was interrupted only by Susan, the sole human in the room. As she raised her hand, the eyes of all the predator species locked onto her. The intensity of their gazes had once unnerved her, but over time she had grown accustomed to it, except for the Corbin, whose shark-like teeth rattling still sent a shiver down her spine. Professor Sci-Fi, a predatory Fen, was no exception, his beady eyes shifting from her hand to her face. He tilted his beak, granting her permission to speak. Susan did her best to maintain a calm voice, despite the growing frustration bubbling within her. "Professor, don't you think that's overstating humanity's role in brokering the ceasefire?" The Corbin, mentioned earlier, slowly clicked his teeth in a sound that Susan had come to understand as a sigh. He had endured her complaints all week, and now she had finally reached her breaking point. Professor Sci-Fi raised a single feather in his crest, a gesture of inquiry, and responded with a hint of curiosity. "Why would you say that?" Susan knew she was walking on thin ice, but she couldn't hold back any longer. "You're mythologizing an entire species," she stated firmly. While humanity did play a crucial part in bringing the herbivorous Mashan and the carnivorous Fen to the negotiating table, it took the work of diplomats from both sides to truly make peace a reality. The professor's feathers curled slightly at his neck, a sign of his growing irritation, but Susan was too determined to back down. She continued, "It's unfair to describe the Machans as panicky or fickle. The longevity of the treaty isn't just due to humanity's involvement, it took wisdom and cooperation from all parties involved." Professor Sci-Fi's feathers ruffled slightly, but he didn't raise his voice. "Susan Patel, there will be no shouting in my classroom," he whistled sharply, a clear warning. Susan hadn't realized she was yelling, and she glanced around at her classmates, most of whom were herbivores, who cringed slightly at the tension. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. "Sorry, Professor," she muttered, though she knew her point was valid. But Sci-Fi was not one to be easily swayed. "Prove it to me with textual evidence, and I might consider it," he said, though Susan knew from experience that this was unlikely. Anytime she wrote a paper that didn't align with his beliefs, she never received more than a 70%. The professor wrapped up the class as Susan fumed silently. She gathered her things, shoving them into her bag with more force than necessary, feeling a surge of frustration and helplessness. As Susan stormed out of the classroom, her friend Gorp, a fellow student, gave her a sympathetic pat on the shoulder with his fin. "Ignore old Sci-Fi," he rumbled in his deep, growly voice. "He'll never change his mind anyway. Want to get drinks tonight?" Susan forced a smile, though her mood was still sour. "Sure, let's get those kebabs you like so much," she said. Gorp wiggled his dorsal fin in approval, and they waved over their mutual friend, a fuzzy Machan named Omai, who was seated on the other side of the lecture hall. Actually, Susan added as they headed towards the door, "I think I'm in the mood for a salad tonight." They ended up getting both kebabs and salads. Gorp, of course, devoured 6 kebabs, while Omi hungrily downed her enormous bowl of sunflower arugula salad. Susan picked at her food, her mind still on the confrontation with Sci-Fi. They sat together at an open-air spaceport cafe, surrounded by aliens of every stripe. It was a scene out of a xenobiologist's dream, and yet it only served to remind Susan of her growing frustration. "Sometimes I want to punch Sci-Fi in the face," she muttered, tearing off a chunk of Caesar meat with exaggerated ferocity. Gorp, always supportive, wiggled his fin in agreement. "He might finally listen to you." Then he said with a chuckle, "Violence is the only universal language." Omi, ever the peacemaker, softly interjected, "I thought it was math." Gorp grumbled in faux wisdom. "Violent math. That's the most universal of languages." Susan couldn't help but snort in amusement, despite her lingering anger. "I'll take him on with a calculator." Then she joked, though the thought of actually confronting Sci-Fi again filled her with dread. Omi looked at her with wide, liquid black eyes, a gaze that invited comparisons to the innocent deer of Earth. But Omi was anything but innocent. She was shrewd and calculating, though she used her appearance to convince others otherwise. "You can't be unreasonable, Susan." "You're human," Omi said, her voice laced with a knowing tone. Susan sighed, leaning back in her chair. "Yeah, and you're supposed to be mild and herbivorous, and that clearly failed," she retorted. Omi primly murmured. "I haven't had an independent thought in my life." Gorp rattled his teeth in an awkward laugh, always a bit uncomfortable with the reminder of the Galactic Society's bias towards predatory species. Humans, being one of the few true sapient omnivores, occupied an odd place in wider society, a reminder that the categories of predator and prey were, in truth, artificial constructs, not immutable truths. The conversation shifted back to their shared frustrations with Professor Sci-Fi. "I wish there was a way to teach Sci-Fi a lesson," Susan mused, pushing her food around her plate. "His analysis of the Machan-Fen War is just stupid and illogical, and he keeps bringing up the 20th anniversary of the treaty as an excuse to spout speciesist drivel. If he says something shitty one more time, I can't guarantee his safety." Omi's ears twitched, a sign of her concern. "Assault is illegal, even if he deserves it," she said mildly. Susan shook her head. "I'm not actually going to punch him, Omi, but I need to do something." Gorp clicked his teeth thoughtfully. "So what are you going to do?" "Drag him in front of the treaty makers of the Machan-Fen ceasefire, so they can yell about how wrong he is." Susan made a thoughtful sound, her mind already racing with possibilities. Susan was one of the few humans on the Lillian spaceport, located deep within Fen territory. The station was a month away from the closest human majority settlement. The human presence on the station was small, with only 12 diplomats, 2 students, and 3 contract workers. Despite the limited human population, Susan knew everyone, and they all knew her. The expat community was tight-knit, with a single group chat and regular meetups at the same restaurant. Thanks to her interest in politics and her major, Susan often heard the latest gossip about international affairs, though security wasn't as strict in this backwater posting. It was at the next monthly human meetup that Susan set her plan in motion. She scanned the bar for her target, her heart pounding with anticipation. Most of the expats were clumped together in groups of 3 or 4. Kimiko, a smooth-talking diplomat, was trying to drag Michael, a tactician, into a conversation, while George was badly flirting with Sanders. But the man Susan was looking for liked to spend the first hour getting very drunk. She spotted Ali, the human science liaison on the station, nursing a whiskey at the bar. Susan approached him with her best friendly smile. "So, Ali, how's it going?" she asked, sliding onto the bar stool next to him. Ali, who was used to her tactics, narrowed his eyes suspiciously. "What is it this time?" he asked immediately. "Nothing," Susan said, trying to keep her tone light. But at Ali's glare, she sighed and admitted, "Well, now that you mention it, any news on that UN ship you mentioned last month?" Ali's suspicion increased as he sipped his whiskey. "It's stopping for a refuel." "Why?" he asked, more hesitant now. Susan pressed on, her mind racing. "Does it have anything to do with the Machan-Fen ceasefire celebration? It's heading to the Fen capital, right?" It wasn't a hard leap to make. The Lillian spaceport was equidistant between the Fen homeworld and the United Human Nation territories. With the anniversary of the ceasefire approaching, it made sense that the UN would send representatives to the festivities. Ali grumbled but eventually caved, as Susan knew he would. "Well, you're not wrong," he admitted. But before he could spill any more, a smooth, deep voice interrupted. "Am I interrupting something here?" The voice belonged to Chinaka Musa, the head of the diplomatic mission. Her arrival brought Ali to a halt before he could spill the beans. Musa was easily the most intimidating human Susan had ever met, rumored to have been part of an elite UN Black Ops team before retiring to this quiet, backwater post. Musa had a reputation for keeping things simple and quiet, and her presence now sent a shiver down Susan's spine. Susan deflated under Musa's gaze. I was just asking about the ship that's stopping to refuel, she muttered, suddenly feeling very small. Musa's dark eyes glittered as she pinned Susan with her gaze. The proper answer is that we can't comment on that, right? Ali Musa said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Ali nodded frantically, clearly spilling his whiskey in the process. So Susan, why are you so curious about a ship that may or may not be refueling here? Musa asked, her gaze never wavering. In for a chip, in for a satellite, Susan thought, taking a deep breath before launching into her explanation. She poured out her frustrations about Professor HFY, his bigoted views, and how she was tired of keeping her mouth shut. She ranted longer and louder than she intended, but once she started, she couldn't stop. Musa listened, her expression unreadable. When Susan finally ran out of steam, Musa looked thoughtful. Susan, I think I might be able to help you with your problem, Musa said, a hint of a smile on her lips. Susan blinked in surprise, her heart skipping a beat. Me too, Kimiko chimed in, nudging Michael, who sighed and nodded. Yeah, count me in, he said, lifting his glass in agreement. The rest of the humans in the bar, along with a few aliens, echoed their support. Susan's grin widened. This might be easier than she had thought. The plan was set in motion, with the combined forces of humanity on the station working together. A complicated system of favors was exchanged and called in while Susan waited in eager anticipation. Her friends, Omai and Gorp, immediately noticed the difference in her demeanor. She no longer raised her voice in class, only speaking when called upon by the professor and giving the most bland, non-committal answers she could manage. Omi and Gorp confronted her about it, their concern evident. What's wrong? Susan Gorp asked, shoving a greasy bag of kebabs into her hands. And a fruit salad, Omai added, placing a small container on top of the takeout box. Susan blinked, surprised by their concern. Nothing's wrong, she lied, though she knew they could see right through her. Omi's ears twitched in a worried gesture, and Gorp snorted, "You're never too busy to yell at injustice. Did you change your mind?" Susan felt a pang of guilt. She had been so focused on her plan that she hadn't considered how her behavior might affect her friends. I just didn't want to give HFY the satisfaction of knowing he got under my skin, she admitted, feeling a bit ashamed. Omi's eyes softened, and she placed a gentle hand on Susan's arm. "Don't let him get to you," she said softly. "You're standing up for what's right, and that means a lot to all of us, especially the Machans. HFY's an asshole, but that doesn't mean you should stop fighting." Gorp nodded in agreement, his usual jovial demeanor replaced with a rare seriousness. "Yeah, what she said," he rumbled. Susan was touched by their support, but she still felt the weight of her plan pressing on her. "I'm not giving up," she assured them, though her voice wavered slightly. "I've got something big planned. Just wait and see." Omi's ears perked up, and Gorp leaned in closer. "What's the plan?" he asked eagerly. With a mischievous glint in her eye, Susan explained her scheme. As she spoke, Omi's excitement grew, while Gorp's expression became a mixture of admiration and concern. "Let me help," Omai said brightly, her enthusiasm infectious. "Of course," Susan replied with a grin. "But you don't have to, if you don't want to," she added, glancing at Gorp. Gorp snorted. "Oh, shut up and tell me what to do with that." The final pieces of the plan fell into place. The restrictions placed on Omai, as a representative of her people, were just one side of the coin. Gorp, with his absurd number of friends in the journalism department, used his connections to spread the word. Susan's facade as a model student was successful, and Professor HFY approved her request to deliver the final project in the form of a traditional Fen call and response epic. Susan had lied about not finding any classmates willing to join her, but HFY, suspecting nothing, granted her permission to work with people outside the class. "Fine, but I will grade you equally harshly," he said, his feathers rippling with disdain. No matter who it is, Susan knew this was her chance. She just needed one more push to set everything in motion. After getting HFY's grudging approval, Susan sent an email to the head of the history department, who was much more tolerant and, just as importantly, always looking for ways to raise the profile of the school. She carefully crafted her message, leaving out certain details and emphasizing the potential for a high-profile event. The department head was thrilled at the idea of having 3 diplomats on their way to the Fen capital speak in the classroom. If the mission heads for both the humans and the Machans wanted to join, then even better. Reporters could be invited to spread the word of the university's efforts in honoring peace. The department head forwarded the email to the college dean, who was equally enthusiastic. Soon, what had started as a simple classroom project spiraled into a major event. Susan's heart raced as more and more people were looped into the growing plan. She belatedly forwarded the email chain to Professor Sci-Fi with an apology for not keeping him informed. As she had anticipated, he could do nothing but give his enthusiastic agreement. After all, if the leaders of his department and the dean endorsed it, who was he to say no? 2 weeks later, the ON's ship docked at the spaceport, and the final piece slid into place. The day of the presentation arrived, and Susan could hardly contain her nervous energy. What had started as a small, personal project had turned into a full-scale event with a packed university auditorium. The dean, the department head, professors, students from various departments, the local mayor, the representative of the interstellar Fen government, almost the entire human population on the station, and dozens of the ON's beamer's passengers were in attendance. Susan's anxiety was compounded by the knowledge that Professor Sci-Fi had pulled her aside the day before to issue a final warning. If she failed, he would show no mercy in grading her. As the auditorium filled, Susan felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She closed her eyes, taking deep breaths to calm herself. Omi and Gorp, seated in the front row, gave her encouraging nods. She started muttering the Gettysburg Address under her breath, a warm-up technique she had learned in high school theater. The familiarity of the words steadied her nerves. Finally, the lights dimmed, and the dean stepped forward to give a brief speech. And now the dean announced, "We present to you Bridging Species," written and spoken by Susan Patel. The audience erupted into polite applause, but Susan barely heard it. Her heart was pounding as she stepped onto the stage, flanked by her 3 guest speakers, Rami, Dr. IPA, and Commander Leslie. The lights dimmed as the performance began. Susan stood at the center, the speakers arranged around her, their presence lending her strength. She raised her arms high, her voice clear and strong as she began the epic. "Who speaks here?" she called out. "I speak here," answered Rami, her voice high and clear. "I speak here," echoed Dr. IPA, warm and surprisingly loud. "I speak here," rumbled Commander Leslie, their voice grounding the performance with its gravity. Susan spread her arms wide, as if she were a Fen, the long, draping sleeves of her costume shimmering under the stage lights. "Who listens here?" she asked, and after a brief hesitation the audience responded, "We listen here, speaker." As the performance progressed, Susan felt herself slipping into the rhythm of the epic. She had memorized every line, every cue for audience participation. The story unfolded, weaving together the experiences of the 3 speakers, their perspectives on the Machan-Fen War, and the role humanity played in bringing about the ceasefire. Susan's voice was steady, despite the dryness in her throat, and the audience was captivated. By the time they reached the climax of the epic, the auditorium was silent, save for the voices on stage. The tension was palpable as the story reached its conclusion, and when Susan finally delivered the final line, the silence held for a heartbeat before the auditorium erupted into applause. The applause was thunderous, echoing in Susan's ears as she lowered her arms, signaling the end of the performance. She barely registered the dean's closing remarks or the congratulatory speeches that followed. It all felt like a dream, the culmination of weeks of planning and effort. As the audience began to disperse, Susan found herself surrounded by well-wishers, shaking hands, wings, and tentacles. She was exhausted, her voice hoarse, but the overwhelming sense of accomplishment kept her going. Among the crowd, she spotted Gorp and Omi, who were beaming with pride. Susan made her way over to them, a tired but genuine smile on her face. Before she could reach her friends, she was stopped by an unfamiliar man. He was nondescript, blending in with the crowd, but his presence commanded attention. "I heard about why you did this," he said, pressing an identification card into her hand. Her personal device pinged, registering the contact information. "That was excellent work. Musa was right to recommend you. Contact me after you graduate," he said before walking away, leaving Susan too stunned to respond. As the man left, he paused briefly to say something to Commander Leslie and Musa, who both nodded in acknowledgement. Susan watched him go, her mind reeling from the unexpected encounter. Still reeling from the encounter, Susan finally reached her friends, collapsing into a chair beside them. "That was amazing," Susan Omai exclaimed, her ears twitching with excitement. Gorp, ever the supportive friend, patted her on the back with one of his tentacles. "You really showed them, Susan." "Sci-Fi must be fuming," he said with a toothy grin. But before Susan could respond, a familiar, stern voice cut through the chatter. "Susan Patel," Professor Sci-Fi said, appearing out of nowhere. Susan nearly jumped out of her seat, her exhaustion suddenly forgotten. "Professor," she stammered, caught off guard by his unexpected presence. "You scared me." Sci-Fi's expression was unreadable as he looked down at her. "Your project was a little melodramatic," he began, his tone clipped. "Your three voices did most of the work. I'm not sure how much credit you deserve." Susan's initial shock quickly turned to irritation. "What are you talking about?" she snapped, her earlier glee dissipating. "I was the speaker. I constructed the narrative, wove the call and response." "The speaker's role is the hardest part." Sci-Fi interrupted her with a low whistle, his feathers rippling with reluctance. "You did well," he said, his voice grudging. Susan blinked, taken aback by the unexpected praise. What she repeated, unable to hide her surprise. Sci-Fi's crest flared briefly, a sign of his discomfort. "I said you did well." "That was a remarkable performance," he repeated, the words sounding as though they were being dragged out of him. Susan stared at him, trying to process what she was hearing. Was that respect she saw in his eyes? Grudging, perhaps, but respect nonetheless. "Oh, thanks," she mumbled, still in shock. She didn't need his approval, she never had, but hearing it was oddly satisfying. Emboldened by his unexpected admission, Susan asked, "Did I change your mind at all?" Professor Sci-Fi's feathers ruffled slightly, his expression hardening. "That entire performance was anecdotal, Susan Patel. Why would I change my mind?" Susan's irritation flared again, but she bit back her retort. "All history is still history," she reminded him, her voice calm but firm. Sci-Fi let out another low whistle, a sound she had come to associate with his begrudging acceptance. "Perhaps I could include one or two Machan perspectives in next year's course," he said, the words clearly causing him discomfort. "Do you have any recommendations?" Susan felt a surge of vindication. "Don't ask me," she said, turning away from him with a satisfied smirk. "Ask the Machans." "Weren't you listening at all with that?" She walked away, leaving Sci-Fi standing there, sputtering in disbelief. As she rejoined Omi and Gorp, she slung an arm around each of their shoulders, her earlier exhaustion replaced by a triumphant energy. "Hey, are you too hungry?" she asked, her grin widening. "Because I'm starving." The three friends laughed as they headed out of the auditorium, the weight of the day finally lifting from Susan's shoulders. She had done it. She had stood up for what she believed in, and in the process, she had made a difference not just for herself, but for her friends, for the Machans, and maybe, just maybe, for Professor Sci-Fi too. And that was a victory worth celebrating. The trio left the auditorium, still buzzing with the aftermath of the performance. The cool air of the spaceport hit them as they stepped outside, providing a welcome contrast to the heat and intensity of the crowded room. The hum of alien conversations and the distant rumble of docking ships filled the background, but Susan was lost in her thoughts. As they walked toward the small, cozy restaurant where they often gathered, Susan found herself reflecting on everything that had led to this moment. The initial frustration with Professor Sci-Fi, The anger that had driven her to take action, and the careful planning that had culminated in one of the most significant achievements of her academic life, all of it felt surreal. Omi nudged her gently, snapping her out of her reverie. "You did something incredible today, Susan," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "You didn't just stand up for yourself, you stood up for all of us. You brought people together in a way that no one else could have." Susan felt a warmth spread through her chest at Omi's words. "I couldn't have done it without you too," she replied sincerely, glancing between Omi and Gorp. "You both helped me keep going when I wanted to give up, and you trusted me with something this important. That means more to me than you know." Gorp, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke up. "You know, Susan, this might be the start of something bigger," he said thoughtfully. "What you did today, bringing together perspectives from different species, challenging prejudices, it's something that could ripple out beyond just our little corner of the galaxy. People are going to remember this." Susan looked at Gorp, surprised by the depth of his insight. "You think so?" she asked, a hint of uncertainty creeping into her voice. Gorp nodded firmly. "Absolutely. You've proven that people can come together despite their differences. And you've shown that it's possible to stand up to authority and make a change, even when it feels impossible." As they reached the restaurant, the familiar scent of grilled food and spices wafted through the air, making Susan's stomach growl in anticipation. They found a table near the back, away from the noise of the bar, and settled in comfortably. The waiter, a friendly Slarian with smooth, iridescent skin, greeted them with a smile. "The usual, Susan?" they asked, already jotting down her order. Susan nodded, feeling a sense of contentment settle over her. "Yes, please. And don't forget the extra sauce this time," she added with a playful wink. The Slarian chuckled and promised to take care of it. As they waited for their food, the conversation flowed easily, a mixture of light-hearted banter and deeper reflections on the day's events. "Oh my, ever the curious one," asked Susan about the mysterious man who had given her his card. "Who do you think he was?" she asked, leaning forward with interest. Susan shrugged, still unsure herself. "I have no idea, but Musa recommended me to him, so he must be someone important. I guess I'll find out after I graduate." Gorp chuckled. "Sounds like you've got some interesting prospects ahead of you, Susan. Maybe you'll end up working for the UHN or even the Galactic Council." Susan laughed, though the idea didn't seem as far-fetched as it might have a few months ago. Their food arrived shortly after, and the conversation paused as they dug into their meals. The familiar flavors and the comfort of being with friends made the moment feel almost perfect. Susan savored each bite, the tension and stress of the past weeks finally melting away. As they ate, she couldn't help but think about what Gorp had said. Maybe this was the start of something bigger. Maybe, just maybe, the impact of her actions would reach farther than she had ever imagined. And if that were the case, she was ready for whatever came next. After they finished their meal, the trio lingered for a while longer, enjoying each other's company and the sense of accomplishment that hung in the air. Eventually, though, the evening began to wind down. Omi stifled a yawn, her ears twitching sleepily. "I think it's time for me to head back," she said, stretching. Gorp nodded in agreement, his usual energy waning as well. "Yeah, it's been a long day. But a good one," he added with a satisfied grin. Susan smiled, feeling a similar exhaustion creeping in. "I think we all deserve a good night's sleep," she said, gathering her things. They left the restaurant together, stepping out into the cool night air. The spaceport was quieter now, the hustle and bustle of the day giving way to the more subdued rhythms of the night shift. As they walked back toward their quarters, Susan felt a deep sense of gratitude for her friends. They had been there for her through everything, and she knew they would continue to be by her side, no matter what the future held. "Thanks for everything. You too," she said softly as they reached the point where they would part ways. Omi and Gorp both smiled, their expressions reflecting the same sentiment. "Anytime," Susan Omi replied, her voice warm and sincere. "We've got your back," Gorp gave her a playful nudge with his tentacle. "And don't forget, we still owe you a proper celebration," he teased. "We'll plan something big after exams are over." Susan laughed, feeling a surge of affection for her friends. "I'll hold you to that," she said, waving as they headed off in different directions. As she made her way back to her quarters, the events of the day replayed in her mind. She had faced down a difficult challenge, stood up for what she believed in, and, in doing so, had earned the respect of even her harshest critic. But more than that, she had strengthened the bonds of friendship and proven that unity was possible, even in the face of deep-seated prejudices. Back in her quarters, Susan collapsed onto her bed, exhaustion finally catching up with her. She stared up at the ceiling, her mind still buzzing with the possibilities that lay ahead. The mysterious man's card was still clutched in her hand, a tangible reminder that her future was full of potential. She placed it on her bedside table, deciding to think about it more in the morning. For now, all she wanted was to sleep, to let the events of the day sink in, and to dream about the future she was just beginning to glimpse. As her eyes drifted shut, a contented smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. Whatever challenges awaited her, she knew she wasn't facing them alone. And that, she thought, was the best part of all. The next morning, Susan woke up feeling refreshed, the anxieties of the previous day replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. She spent a few moments lying in bed, allowing herself to fully wake up before starting her day. The events of the previous day still felt surreal, but the more she thought about them, the more she realized just how much she had accomplished. With a determined smile, she got out of bed, ready to tackle whatever came next. She knew that she still had a long way to go, but for the first time she felt truly confident in her ability to make a difference. Susan spent the day going about her usual routine, but there was a newfound spring in her step. She attended her classes, interacted with her classmates, and even managed to avoid any confrontations with Professor HFY. Her mind, however, kept returning to the mysterious man and the card he had given her. By the time evening rolled around, she couldn't resist the urge any longer. She sat down at her desk, took a deep breath, and picked up the card. The name on it was unfamiliar, but the title was unmistakable: Senior Liaison, United Human Nations. Susan's heart skipped a beat. This was no ordinary contact. She quickly composed a message, thanking the man for his kind words and expressing her interest in learning more about potential opportunities after graduation. She hit send, her heart racing with excitement and nervousness. She knew it might be days, even weeks, before she received a reply, but just taking that step felt empowering. As she closed her personal device, she felt a sense of anticipation building within her. The future was uncertain, but it was also full of possibilities, and for the first time in a long while, Susan was excited about where it might lead. She was ready for whatever came next, knowing that she had the strength, determination, and support of her friends to face it head-on. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. The success of her presentation had spread throughout the campus, and Susan found herself approached by students and professors alike, all eager to discuss the implications of her work. Some wanted to know more about the Machan-Fen War, while others were curious about her approach to the call and response format. Susan was happy to engage with them, but she couldn't help but feel a bit overwhelmed by the sudden attention. Still, she handled it with grace, knowing that this was an opportunity to further her ideas and perhaps inspire others to think more critically about the narratives they had been taught. Amidst all the new interactions, Susan didn't forget her friends. True to his word, Gorp organized a celebration for the three of them, a chance to unwind and enjoy each other's company after the intense weeks they had just gone through. They spent the evening laughing, reminiscing about their journey, and looking forward to the future. Omi, always the planner, even suggested that they consider working together on a project after graduation, something that could make a real impact in the galaxy. Susan was intrigued by the idea, and they spent hours brainstorming possibilities, their excitement growing with each new idea. As the celebration wound down, Susan realized just how lucky she was to have friends like Omi and Gorp. They had supported her through every step of her journey, and now, as they looked toward the future, she knew they would continue to stand by her side. The thought filled her with a deep sense of gratitude and determination. Whatever the future held, she was ready to face it with them. And as they parted ways that night, Susan couldn't help but feel that this was only the beginning of something truly extraordinary. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel. For every comment that says we will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.